Hello, everyone. Today, I'd like to talk about immigration. Again, yes. Specifically, immigration's capacity to destroy civilizations. And we're going to be talking about one particular civilization that was destroyed by immigration, and that is Nazi Germany. House that for a plot twist. And so early in the video as well. So let's talk about how immigration caused the downfall of Nazi Germany. At the end of the 1930s, Germany was resurgent. After struggling for many years with an economy in recession and a worthless currency, the government initiated numerous public building projects to stabilize the economy and put its citizens back to work. The military was greatly expanded, and a combination of diplomacy and military action secured many of the adjacent provinces to Germany and put them under direct German rule. By the early 1940s, the vast majority of Europe was controlled either directly by Nazi Germany or by Anhalt. Eventually, they ran into a problem, and that problem is one that has felled many great civilizations throughout history: immigration. Immigrants were attracted to Nazi Germany from all over. In the East, great swarms of Russian immigrants crossed the border into German territory. And from the Hook, immigrants from a great many nations made the dangerous channel crossing, often in small, unsafe boats, and their sheer number overwhelmed the German border forces. And who were these immigrants? Well, they certainly weren't a representative cross-section of wider society. There were hardly any women, children, or elderly. No, they were mainly young, military-aged males who made absolutely no attempt to integrate into the culture of Nazi Germany. In fact, they were frequently involved in violent clashes with German security forces, which put a great strain on the state, as well as carrying out various terrorist bombing campaigns to frighten the populace and destroy vital German infrastructure. Germany proved completely unable to handle the sheer scale of the migrant crisis, and eventually they were overwhelmed completely, and their civilization was destroyed. Now then, what was all that rubbish I just said? Well, I want to make 2 points about it. The first is, it was all nonsense. Obviously, sort of a pointless, misleading bunch of gibberish. The second thing I want to say about it, though, is that technically, actually, nothing that I just said was untrue, as long as we don't mind stretching certain definitions of words to the breaking point anyway, because that was the problem with what I just said. The actual events did happen as stated, but the terminology that I used to describe them happening was obviously incorrect and misleading. The immigrants were actually foreign soldiers loyal to governments that were at war with Nazi Germany. They were only migrants in the sense that they went from one place to another. The point of my Nazi Germany example there is to show how misleading contemporary political terminology with all its associated implications can be if we apply it to events from the distant past. You see, we all, of course, familiar on some level with the events of the Second World War, it being relatively recent, so my deceptive language there really stood out. Modern audiences will be less familiar with events from ancient history, though. The fall of Rome, for instance, which is what this video is actually about. So we'll try and keep that in mind going forward. When someone points to the ancient world to make a point about the modern one, don't take what they say at face value, because it might be just as misleading as me little history of World War E. Be right there. So then, with that in mind, did immigration cause the fall of Rome? This video is sort of a companion piece to my previous video about Rome, which was a response to Stefan Molinak's claims that loose morality, women's rights, taxation, and various other things were the cause of the fall of Rome. And starting out here, I'll repeat a few things to be considered from that video. Firstly, when people say the fall of the Roman Empire, they usually mean the fall of the Western Roman Empire, because the eastern half kept on going for another 1,000 years, until someone invented a cannon strong enough to bring down the walls of Constantinople, which in itself highlights the more practical and tangible reasons that empires often fall, not due to some degradation of morality or national spirit, but instead because someone invented a really big gun and shot them with it. Virtue and spirit are all well and good, but they re not going to stop a 600-pound cannonball. So anyway, we were going to be talking about the fall of the Western Roman Empire, which most historians date to 476 AD, when a chieftain called Odoacer revolted against the empire and deposed Romulus Augustus, the last emperor of the West. And I see two approaches only when someone's attempting to pin the fall of the Roman Empire onto one singular event or concept with the aim of making a modern political point. The first is one of direct comparison. The Roman Empire is the EU, and the Germanic tribes who fought against Rome are directly analogous to modern migrants and asylum seekers, for instance. Now, this approach is easily foiled by simply pointing out the many differences in the two situations. Ravenna fell because it was captured by a military loyal to a rebellious enemy king. For an actual direct historical comparison to be legitimate, we'd need to see something like an army of former Syrian allies revolting against the EU and then invading Europe and occupying Brussels or something. This reclassification of an enemy armed force to simply immigrants is every bit as misleading as my Nazi Germany example. Now the other approach you see, the more interesting one, the one that acknowledges the differences between given historical and contemporary situations, but makes the case that there were enough similarities to justify the comparison. And that's a little more interesting to talk about. For instance, in 376 AD, 100 years before the fall of Ravenna, Rome did have to deal with a migrant crisis which led to a costly war, the Gothic War, during a precarious time in Roman history when the empire could ill afford costly wars. And it is this crisis that various clever clogs who know their Roman history often cite when making the argument that immigration led to the fall of Rome. And so we'll also be talking about that migrant crisis today. But before we get to that specifically, however, I'd like to talk about a few relevant events from throughout Roman history, which I think are key to understanding exactly how and why the Gothic War started. And I'd like to kick off by asking a question, and it's quite a big one. What actually did cause the fall of the Roman Empire? And the interesting thing about the various singular reasons we could cite here is that since Roman history covers such a huge amount of time, and Rome itself existed under so many varying forms of organization and government, there's invariably an alternate example from Roman history that counters any one reason by itself. Now, for instance, we could look at the fall of Rome strictly militarily. Rome fell because it was defeated in battle in a very practical sense. But then we can look through Rome's history to all the other times it was defeated in battle. The Carthaginian general Hannibal, for example, inflicted a string of costly defeats upon the Romans during the Second Punic War. He defeated Rome in the Battle of Trebia, the Battle of Lake Trasimene, and the Battle of Cannae, which was one of the costliest defeats Rome ever suffered, and one of the bloodiest battles in human history, with up to 70,000 Romans killed or captured in a single day, including a sitting consul for that year and up to 80 senators. Rome was also no stranger to losing battles against the various Germanic peoples. In one of the other great losses in Roman history, the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, 3 entire Roman legions were ambushed and destroyed by an alliance of Germanic tribes. Now, Rome did not fall after these defeats. Rome's great military strength was not necessarily that they were invincible on the battlefield, although, of course, they were very strong. It was their ability to absorb and recover from defeats. The sheer size of the empire, as well as its organization and logistics, meant that Rome could handle the occasional military loss, which was a rare thing in the ancient world. Look at the rebellion of Boudicca, for instance. Boudicca's rebellion defeated the Romans at Camulodunum. They sacked the city, they destroyed the Ninth Legion, they sacked Londinium, they sacked Verulamium, and then they lost one battle to the Romans, and the rebellion was broken and Boudicca committed suicide. For most ancient military forces, this was how it went. Being defeated meant just that you were defeated. For the Romans, though, if a legion was defeated, they just sent another legion. Rome's enemies usually had to win every single time, whereas Rome often only had to win once. So Rome was clearly no stranger to military losses and was always previously able to recover. And so, at the end of the empire, we have to ask what happened to that ability. Why did Rome recover the final time? What was different? Was different. And this is where we have to look beyond strictly singular reasons that Rome fell, because any one reason can't tell us the whole story clearly. So by the time it fell, Rome had lost its ability to recover from military defeats the way it had in the past, but it had lost other important abilities too. For instance, the ability to make and maintain allies. So let's talk about that for a while. And to introduce this concept, gonna read a little of the Annals of Tacitus. This section chronicling a debate in 48 AD in the Roman Senate during the reign of Emperor Claudius, who is my favorite emperor, being a very interesting character and a historian himself, so he knew his stuff. The debate was to answer whether or not Rome should allow Gauls to be appointed to public office in Rome. Gaul being roughly the territory covered by modern-day France, which had at this point been conquered by Rome. Now Gauls, being provincials, had certain rights in the Roman political system, but were ineligible to run for public office or sit as senators in Rome. And, I quote, in the consulship of Aulus Vitellius and Lucius Phipps Darnus, the question of filling up the Senate was discussed, and the chief men of Gallia Comata, as it was called, who had long possessed the rights of allies and of Roman citizens, sought the privilege of obtaining public offices at Rome. There was much talk of every kind on the subject, and it was argued before the emperor would vehement opposition. Italy, it was asserted, is not so feeble as to be unable to furnish its own capital with the Senate. Once, our native-born citizens sufficed for peoples of our own kin, and we are by no means dissatisfied with the Rome of the past. To this day we cite examples which under our old customs the Roman character exhibited as to valor and renown. Is it a small thing that the Veneti and insurers have already burst into the Senate house unless a mob of foreigners, a troop of captives, so to say, is now forced upon us? What distinctions will be left for the remnants of our noble houses, or for any impoverished senators from Latium? Every place will be crowded with these millionaires, whose ancestors of the second and third generations at the head of hostile tribes destroyed our armies with fire and sword, and actually besieged the divine Julius at Alesia. These are recent memories. What if there were to rise up the remembrance of those who fell in Rome's citadel, and are heralded by the hands of these same barbarians? Let them enjoy indeed the title of citizens, but let them not vulgarize the distinctions of the Senate and the honors of office. So that's how Tacitus recounts the opposing side of the argument there, and it goes that Rome does not need foreigners to fill its senatorial ranks, and admitting them would vulgarize the office. Also mentioned are events from the Gallic Wars, such as Julius Caesar being besieged at Alesia, as well as the sack of Rome in or around 390 by a Gallic tribe, the Senones. The Gauls were relatively recent enemies of Rome, it was argued, and thus should not be granted full rights. And let's keep reading and see Claudius' response. These and like arguments failed to impress the emperor. He at once addressed himself to answer them, and thus harangued the assembled senate. My ancestors, the most ancient of whom was made at once a citizen and a noble of Rome, encouraged me to govern by the same policy of transferring to this city all conspicuous merit wherever found. What was the ruin of Sparta and Athens but this, that mighty as they were in war, they spurned from them as aliens those whom they had conquered. Our founder Romulus, on the other hand, was so wise that he fought as enemies and then hailed as fellow citizens several nations on the very same day. Strangers have reigned over us. That freedmen citizens should be entrusted with public offices is not, as many wrongly think, a sudden innovation, but was a common practice in the old Commonwealth. But it will be said, we have fought with the Senones. I suppose then that the Volsci and Equine never stood in array against us. Our city was taken by the Gauls, while we also gave hostages to the Etruscans and passed under the yoke of the Samnites. On the whole, if you review all our wars, never has one been finished in a shorter time than with the Gauls. Thenceforth, they have preserved an unbroken and loyal peace. United as they now are with us by manners, education, and intermarriage, let them bring us their gold and their wealth rather than enjoy it in isolation. Everything, senators, which we now hold to be of the highest antiquity, was once new. Plebeian magistrates came after patrician, Latin magistrates after plebeian, magistrates of other Italian peoples after Latin. This practice, too, will establish itself, and what we are this day justifying by precedents will be itself a precedent. So what is Claudius saying there? Well, in this section here, he first lists a Gallic tribe that was at war with Rome, but then two Italian ones. And he's saying, yes, the Gauls were at war with us, but so too were the cities we now control in Italy. We suffered defeats at the hands of the Gauls, but we also suffered defeats at the hands of Italians. And we should welcome the defeated as allies, lest we face the same fate as Athens or Sparta. In short, those opposing the Gauls being admitted into the Senate said, "Hey, we don't need these foreigners coming over here telling us how to run things." And Claudius responds, well, half of us sitting here were also once foreigners to Rome, so maybe chill out about it a bit and it'll be fine. It loses something in translation like that, but there you go. And what I'd like you to take away from that little scene there is that for Claudius, one of Rome's great strength was its ability to turn former enemies into allies, like Goku. And I'd like to elaborate a little on a conflict from Roman history involving some of the Italian tribes mentioned by Claudius there. From 91 to 88, the Roman Republic fought the Social War, also known as the War of the Allies, which saw several Italian city-states rise up in revolt against Rome. And the reasoning behind this conflict is especially noteworthy here. So then, prior to the Social War, Rome had effective control of the whole Italian peninsula. They had defeated or allied with the other tribes and city-states and had the ability to both tax and demand military aid from them. And this was not an insignificant thing. By the 2nd century, Rome's Italian allies comprised a majority of its military forces. But even though the allies were being taxed by Rome, as well as being made to fight in Rome's wars, they received a disproportionately small share of the spoils and land, and they did not have Roman citizenship rights. And the allies were increasingly ticked off about this. Any Americans listening will know the term, no taxation without representation. Well, This was kind of one of those situations. Now, a Roman politician called Marcus Livius Drusus attempted to address this problem in 91 by introducing reforms that would grant the Alis Roman citizenship, which would probably have been a smart move, given they were on the verge of open rebellion. The response of the Roman Senate, however, was to ignore the problem and have Drusus assassinated. And as a result, the social war broke out almost immediately. So, good move there, Roman Senate. Rome eventually won the social war, but they did not have an easy time of it by any means, suffering several losses, and notably, they were forced to offer a major concession to the Alis to get them to stop fighting: full Roman citizenship, which is what the Alis wanted in the first place. So, why am I telling you about the social war? Well, first off, it's a time in Roman history when they had to learn an important lesson the hard way. Do not, Claudius says, treat those you've conquered as aliens. Or, at the very least, don't give increasing amounts of military power to people with no political power, because before long they will use the former to take the latter. The other reason I mention the social war is that Odoacer's rebellion, centuries later, the one that deposed the last Roman emperor, was triggered in much the same way. Odoacer was a military leader who, in the summer of 476 AD, visited Ravenna and asked Orestes, who was the father of the teenage emperor Romulus Augustus, to make good on various promises. You see, Orestes had himself deposed the previous emperor, Julius Nepos, and he had promised Odoacers and soldiers land on which to settle if they supported his rebellion. However, when it came time to grant the land for the soldiers, Orestes reneged on his promise. Now, a more forward-thinking man might have questioned the logic of refusing to pay a mercenary army that clearly have no qualms about overthrowing a Roman emperor, given that they just done that exact same thing to the last guy, eh? So Orestes really incredibly should have paid them. Predictably, Odoacer and his men didn't like not being paid and broke into open revolt. And they sacked a bunch of cities, defeated Orestes in the field, took Ravenna, deposed young Romulus Augustus, and that's all she wrote for the Western Roman Empire. Now, it's not a direct one-to-one comparison by any means, but both the social war and Odoacer's rebellion have a few similarities. Non-Roman armies fighting for Rome but being refused what they feel is an equal share of the spoils. Military power being in the hands of people with limited political power, and both situations show the danger of mistreating your allies when they make up the majority of your military forces. You see, in the latter days of the empire especially, Rome increasingly relied upon mercenaries to fight their battles for them, which works perfectly fine right up until you don't pay them, like Orestes found out. There are also stories of people fighting Rome who didn't necessarily want to. Both conflicts were entirely avoidable. You know, the Italian allies wanted rights and odoicer. Troops wanted payment and land on which to settle, but they only rebelled when denied those things that they felt their military service had earned for them. And notably, these peoples wanted to be part of Roman society. They wanted to live on Roman land and have Roman rights. And it's an interesting thing. For many, being in the empire was seen as a benefit, and that's how it had to be. It would be impossible for Rome to hold its whole empire by military force alone. For most provinces in the empire, particularly the interior provinces, seeing a Roman legion at all, let alone a battle, would be a very rare occurrence. Rome's forces were most often found on its frontiers, and the empire was far too large and populous for the legions to hold it all if everyone decided to rebel at once. Now, they didn't rebel because, for the most part anyway, they wanted to be in the empire, and migration into the empire occurred throughout its whole history. For instance, Emperors Diocletian and Constantine both resettled tribes from outside to inside the empire, with the aim of negating the threat they posed as outsiders as well as providing more people to work, pay taxes, and be recruited into the legions. In the 1st century AD, a Roman governor of Moesia was recorded as transferring 100,000 people of those living across the Danube into the empire with, I quote, their wives, children, chiefs, and kings. And this was recorded in a dedication to him as one of his great achievements. And that's something you wouldn't see today, is a politician bragging about bringing 100,000 migrants into the country. So Rome did have a history of successfully and peacefully managing migrations into the empire. And so now we come to the Gothic War, which I mentioned earlier, the war that followed a migration of Gothic tribes into the empire. And so we have to ask what went wrong. What was done differently in that case to distinguish it from the successful migrations? So in 376 AD, a large number of Gothic peoples arrived on the Danube River, which was the border of Roman territory, and asked if they could settle inside the empire. The Goths were fleeing from the Huns, who were currently riding around on horseback, shooting arrows at people, and generally just being menacing. The Goths sent envoys to the Eastern Roman Emperor Valens, saying, "Can we move in with you, please?" And Valens said, "Okay, that sounds neat. You know I can tax you. You can join the legions. Let's do it." I'm streamlining the actual historical record here, if you hadn't noticed. Now, this correspondence took some time, as Valens was off preparing for a campaign against the Sassanid Empire in the east. Now, firstly, since the emperor was preparing for war on another front, he had left only a skeleton crew manning the Danube border. And secondly, since the correspondence took a while, the Goths had thousands of people all sitting put on a river bank for a very long time, and they started to run out of provisions. So when they began crossing the river into Rome, they were coming as a hungry and desperate people who outnumbered the Roman border force. And they were armed, too. In the relevant section of The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, historian Edward Gibbon notes that one of the various ways this migration differed from the previous migrations was that the Goths managed to keep hold of their arms via a series of extravagant bribes to corrupt Roman officials. And those bribed Roman officials turned a blind eye and did not disarm the incoming migrants, as was the standard practice. So the Goths were armed, desperate, hungry, and locally, at least, outnumbered the Roman military. Kind of a precarious situation, but however not one that necessarily had to lead to violence. I mean, the Goths wanted to be part of the Roman Empire, and they'd come in peace. As long as the Romans weren't actively antagonistic towards the Goths, there's no reason they couldn't have been resupplied, apportioned some land, and set to work churning out taxes and soldiers. Enter Lupercinus, a Roman lieutenant of Emperor Valens, who was in charge of the military government in the area where the Goths were crossing the border. And I'll now read you his entire Wikipedia article. Lupercinus was a Roman lieutenant of Valens in Thrace in the late 4th century AD. His reputed poor treatment of the Merovingian Goths under Fritigern led to the Gothic Wars and the Battle of Adrianople. Wonderfully short and to the point there. Now, if we click through, the Battle of Adrianople is an upcoming battle between the Goths and the Romans, which is an overwhelming defeat for the Romans and in which the Emperor Valens dies. Furthermore, from Wikipedia, what a jerk. So what did he actually do that was so bad it started a war? Well, upon encountering the masses of hungry and desperate Goths, Lupercinus and the rest of the Roman border forces saw the Roman equivalent of $signs. They sold the Goths food at exorbitant prices, quickly stripping them of their wealth and valuables. And when the Goths ran out of things to trade for food, the Romans started accepting as payment Gothic children, who were then sold into slavery. And I'll quote Roman soldier and historian Ammianus Marcellinus here, talking about the greed of the Roman commanders, which even if they were to choose their own judges, must appear wholly unpardonable, must be mentioned. When the barbarians who had been conducted across the river were in great distress from want of provisions, those detested generals conceived the idea of a most disgraceful traffic. And having collected hounds from all quarters with the most insatiable rapacity, they exchanged them for an equal number of slaves, among whom were several sons of men of noble birth. Woo, that's a bit of a mouthful, that bit. That took a few takes, and no mistake. And what did it say? Well, the Romans forced the Goths to sell their children into slavery for dog meat, which is pretty rubbish behavior, frankly. And I just want to point out and make clear, Marcellinus places the blame for what is about to happen squarely on the greedy Roman commanders, rather than the migrant Goths. So anyway, the Goths were pretty ticked off at this children for dog meat scam the Romans were running, to put it somewhat lightly. And I'm sure one or two of them probably started doing a little mental arithmetic, and possibly noticing that there were a lot more of them than there were Roman gods. And so grumbling turned into shouting, and shouting into fighting, and shouted "Shogun" in turn into Now, Lupercinus, correctly fearful that he was about to have a full-blown revolt on his hands, decided to help speed things along a bit by inviting a bunch of the Gothic leaders to a banquet, and then, when they were there, executing their guards and imprisoning them. Which is very odd behavior. Maybe he was an ancient accelerationist, who knows? Anyway, after Lupercinus raid wedged a bunch of their chiefs, war was unavoidable, obviously. And though Rome would technically win, it would be only a Pyrrhic victory, with the later Battle of Adrianople being particularly costly for the Romans. It also changed how Rome dealt with barbarian tribes going forward. The huge difficulty the empire had in winning the Gothic War exposed it as something of a paper tiger, and migrating groups were now able to negotiate with Rome on their own terms. And as a result, people like the Visigoths were able to settle inside the empire, while remaining a unified people loyal to their own leaders rather than the emperor. They were living in the empire, but they had not integrated into the empire. All this brings me to my main point. So often, the expectation to integrate is placed entirely on the migrant people. However, that is how integration works. Integration is a two-way street. The Gothic War was the result of Rome's failure to integrate the Goths. It was just one more of Rome's abilities that they had lost near the end of the Western Empire. Rather than turning enemies into allies, Rome was now instead turning potential allies into enemies. And this next point is shamelessly stolen from Mike Duncan's History of Rome podcast, which you should listen to if you haven't, because it's great. In the conclusion to his series, Duncan wonders what the Western Roman Empire could have been had it successfully integrated the various Germanic peoples. You see, increasingly near the end of the Western Roman Empire, the most powerful and capable leaders were of Germanic origin. However, Rome's unwillingness to see a German as emperor imposed a ceiling on the political power they could attain. And that's why, at the end, we start seeing puppet emperors. You know, emperors of the correct birthplace and from the correct families, placed onto the imperial throne to act as proxies for the Germanic generals who had the real military power. Duncan asks us to consider why we never saw an Emperor Aetius or an Emperor Stilicho, who were two such capable leaders who were not able to become emperor. And it was only a matter of time before someone like Odoacer came along and just neglected to appoint a puppet emperor. And you see, this is the interesting thing about Roman history. I can look at the exact same chain of events that someone might use to claim that migrants caused the fall of the empire, and instead conclude that it was Rome's increasing xenophobia and mistreatment of migrants that caused the fall of the empire. You know, Rome didn't fall because of migration. There had always been migration. And for most of its history, Rome understood that when handled intelligently and compassionately, migration is a benefit. Rome fell, in part anyway, when it started acting against this knowledge. And I'd like to wrap up here with a thought. If we simplify the armed force that took Ravenna and opposed the last emperor to just immigrants, then yes, immigration, in a silly and misleading sense, caused the fall of the Western Roman Empire. However, by that exact same logic, immigration created the Roman Empire, because Romans, setting out from Rome, immigrated throughout the Mediterranean, taking over cities and civilizations and filling them with Roman buildings and Roman people and Roman legions. So if you're a fan of the Romans, then immigration is good, right? Do you catch my drift? I've flipped it. Ivy turned the argument back on itself. It's clever, that isn't it? Anyway, thanks a lot for watching, everyone. Like, subscribe, leave a comment, all the usual things. Let me know what you feel about me doing just a straight history video. If I bored everyone to death, I apologize. Also, before I go, I need a name for my YouTube channel. It was called Scene and Jen, but Jen isn't involved in the YouTube videos at all anymore. Though don't worry, Jen fans, you can still find her over on Twitch. Anyway, I've taken Jen's name off the YouTube channel, but I can't just have a YouTube channel called Scene, can I? I don't know. Anyway. So if anyone has any bright ideas, please leave them in a comment below this video. I'm very excited to see what you come up with. Also, a big thank you, as always, to all me supporters over on Patreon, who also, as always, are scrolling by right now, feeling all smug and satisfied that they in the credits. And if you'd like to be up there with them, consider pledging me $1 or $2. Anyway, thanks a lot, and see you next time, folks.